Welcome back to the Foreign Desk podcast. I'm Lisa Daftari. Each week, as we delve into the foreign policy subjects that we talk about here on this show, we always arrive at the same question. Who's driving this narrative? Who's shaping the perspective? Who's giving us the information here in the United States for the general public to decide on how they feel? How do they feel about the Palestinians and the Israelis? How do they feel about the Iran nuclear issue? And to discuss all this, I've decided this week to bring in two of the most fantastic journalists I know who are covering the Middle East and foreign policy, from the nuclear deal to the Abraham Accords to Gaza to Israel, to make sense of all of this. I'd like to welcome Benjamin Weinthal, a fellow at the nonpartisan DC-based national security think tank, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, FDD. He's also a correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. You can see his pieces and exclusives all over social media. And of course, Adam Kredo, senior writer reporting on national security and foreign policy for the Washington Free Beacon. He is an award-winning journalist. He's broken news across the globe, been featured in Wall Street Journal, Weekly Standard, Commentary, Drudge, the Jerusalem Post, and many, many others. And of course, Adam gets some fantastic scoops and of course, also on Twitter and all over social media. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
There's so many journalists covering these issues for the mainstream media, for online publications. And, you know, I've chosen you two because, first of all, I know you both very well. And secondly, I know how hard you work at getting the scoops that you get. You've both been killing it, especially as of recently, been consistently reporting on these very important issues, particularly when it seems like other people are giving up the opportunity to do so. So I thought it's worth a conversation to talk about the challenges that you guys are facing day in and day out. I know it can't be easy. Maybe it appears easy to others in the audience who may not be aware of what's going on behind the scenes, but I think nowadays it's pretty obvious the challenges we all face for a free press, for free speech, for social media freedom. I mean, it's like a category unto itself, right? Banning the former president from our platforms. Who else gets banned? If you say something you don't like, someone doesn't like, you get canceled, you get fired. I mean, there's so much going on, but I want to ask each of you. Benjamin, I'll start with you. What are some of the challenges you face daily in covering the areas that you do?
Well, again, thanks for having me on your show, Lisa. It's a real pleasure and honor. I've followed your show and your writings for years. I think the real challenges right now are to folks in terms of the Iranian regime and the nuclear negotiations in Vienna. The challenge is to highlight Iran's illicit behavior. Both Adam and I have recently written articles about Iran's illicit nuclear weapons procurement activities in Europe. And the stories were picked up by outlets in the Middle East. I'm currently in Jerusalem. So outlets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE have picked up these stories, but they haven't reached a broader audience, I think, in the Western world, in the United States, including Western Europe, because a lot of these countries in Western Europe are not, I think, as assertive as they should be. And I'm talking about the press here in these countries in uncovering what Iran is doing on their soil and why the Iranian nuclear deal has some severe weaknesses that does not prevent Iran from building a nuclear weapons device.
I mean, I want to follow up on that because I think it's very interesting that you pointed out that the European journalists, and I would argue American mainstream journalists as well, are not keen on calling out the regime, just like you two are so bravely. And it's ironic that I say bravely, right? It's like as clear as day that this regime is, you know, involved in nefarious activities, is you know, making its weapons program more robust by the day, is pouring billions of dollars into terrorism, but yet they're reluctant to cover it. Why? Where does this come from?
Well, the many of the states that are involved in negotiations right now, for example, Germany, France, Britain, have interest in reviving the accord because they want to cut energy deals with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Germany has consistently been Iran's most important European trade partner, and the business of Germany is export business. A famous WikiLeaks diplomatic document showed that Merkel's business community was exerting enormous pressure on her a number of years ago not to sanction an Iranian bank in Hamburg that allows transactions to take place. And Merkel resisted for a while until the U.S. had to clamp down. So I think that's one factor. And I think the other factor is Elliot Abrams also pointed this out yesterday, in his blog over at the Council for Foreign Relations. He was the former U.S. envoy assigned for Iran. That a number of the important U.S. publications, I think he cited the Washington Post and New York Times, have not picked up on the recent reports about Western intelligence agencies in Sweden, Holland, and Germany disclosing that Iran has worked on a nuclear weapons device in 2020 and sought to secure technology for a weapons of mass destruction program. So I thought that was also very interesting. I should note that the Washington Free Beacon, where Adam works, and Fox News, where I contribute articles to, have reported on these intelligence documents.
Right. And I remember, Adam, I think you broke the story in terms of the American media. And, can you tell us a little bit about that? I don't know if everyone's familiar with it. We try our best, right? The three of us and many others, we try our best to spread this information on social media and elsewhere where we have access to readers and our audiences. But as Benjamin very, very correctly said, it doesn't reach all those ears and eyes that it should. Can you quickly tell us about that story? And I have a few follow-up questions for you as well.
Sure. The one I had was very similar to what Benny found. German intel essentially concluded that in the last year, 2020, Iran was seeking nuclear weapons technology, weapons of mass destruction technology, and both you and Benny are again right that it's wildly undercovered. You would think that a foreign affairs section of a Washington Post or a New York Times might pick up on this type of report, particularly since they're so eager to cover the Biden administration's renewed diplomacy with Iran. But yet the coverage of that is usually pretty much repeating the State Department talking points on it, that we're going to ease sanctions and we're doing that because Iran agrees to behave, when there really in reality is no indication that Iran is willing to behave, which also kind of jives with what I reported just today. The State Department, in a somewhat surprising move, I cover the State Department almost exclusively, and I'm in the building as much as possible. It's been a bit more difficult in the age of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
They're not keeping their briefings open to all reporters. I think very importantly, people should know that the State Department right now is keeping their briefings pooled coverage. What does that mean? Only the anointed members of the press are allowed in there. It's 6 or 7 rotating, and it's your Washington Times, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN.
The echo chamber.
That's almost precisely right. And
Right.
people like me, even though I'm credentialed, cannot get into them now. So we can't ask these questions. What is your reaction to a German intelligence report or a Dutch intelligence report that finds Iran is working on weapons of mass destruction? How does that influence your position in the negotiations? They're not answering any of these questions. But to go back to what I just broke before we got on the air here, is the State Department being very honest for a change and saying that, look, sanctions relief, full-scale sanctions relief is on the table. Their exact remarks are, we'll do anything that's needed to put us back in compliance with the 2015 Accord. And as we here all know, putting us back in compliance means essentially all of the sanctions that were implemented by the Trump administration, those go away.
This is tremendous and it's mind-boggling. And I'm not surprised that you anticipated my next question, which was the tremendous access that you had to Secretary of State Pompeo under the former administration. And now you are a credentialed journalist. I mean, this is, yes, there's COVID, but there is such a pronounced, change going forward that will be established as just practice, where it will be that only the, as you said, the anointed, those that are handpicked, those who will only give a positive, report onto what the administration is doing, and not press back and not ask the important questions, as you just said. What are some of the challenges that you face covering the State Department, and how do you go around that?
Well, look, it remained very difficult in terms of access. All of us are vaccinated at this point. The State Department press corps, which comprises those major publications that I mentioned before, plus others like me who are fully credentialed for access to the building and theoretically should be back in those press briefings. But the Biden administration, I think, has found that it was, or is, very convenient for them to continue these arbitrary COVID regulations where it's only several people in the briefings and everybody else has to call in over the phone. Mind you, when you call in over the phone, they know what line it is and they can choose to accept your call or not accept your call. I've experienced that where you get on the line and you get in the queue to answer a question and you know that you're among the first in there, but yet your question is never taken. Right. I think that's intentional, and that really is procedurally, in terms of performing the journalism, an issue because I can't get my questions asked. Luckily, over the years, I've been covering state for about nine, almost 10 years now. I've formed very good relationships with the Public Affairs Department, and I will praise them in saying that they do their very best to get back on my requests for comment. But again, it's written, so you don't get more of an honest response when it's written versus off the cuff. I think you get more of a window into the administration's thinking when it's off the cuff, and you can question the chief spokesman or the deputy spokesman versus them having time to kind of craft their response. I know we're getting a little inside baseball here, but it is important in terms of the news product that comes out from that process.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are interested in this because it's now, once we're silencing people because of their opinion, that becomes everyone's issue, right? People getting their, as I said in the intro, they're getting canceled, they're getting their, social media platforms suspended, and it's not inside talk anymore. This is, people want to know where their information is coming from. It used to be that a journalist would cover without slant. But I remember the night that President Trump was elected, I was at the headquarters at the Hilton in New York City, and seeing the press pool that was roped off, seeing them just break down and start crying and not able to do their job any further. And it seems like that was the line in the sand, basically, to say, now we are just, we become activists. And that's my next topic that I want to discuss with you guys. Benjamin, I know you've gotten people, removed from their tenure at universities, professors who are spewing hatred. You are working towards getting, the Iranian team banned from the Olympics because of the execution of that very innocent, peaceful protester, the wrestler Navid Afkari. You've done some tremendous work with your journalism. And, at what point, obviously, journalism has to be effective, and that's the beautiful thing about our work, and we're blessed to do it every day. But at what point, do we stop and say, this shouldn't be our job? We're not activists. We should be the ones telling the truth, and the truth should be understood by all in a way that is, that's moral. That's just moral. We're not all going to agree on everything. We have different baseball teams, and we have different basketball teams, and we have different preferences in ice cream color, ice cream flavors, rather. I get all that. We have differences of opinion on many issues, but there are some issues that are just morally right and wrong. Iran shouldn't be able to kill 3,000 innocent people, let's say 1,500 by lower estimates and thousands of people by higher estimates, and have people here in the United States in the mainstream media championing or advocating for sanctions to be removed, for us to get back into a deal, to give them billions of dollars to put back into terrorism. Benjamin, my question to you is, at how has your role as a journalist changed because of the environment in which you're working?
Well, I think, in the region that I cover, the Middle East mainly, and the interplay between the Middle East and Europe, there are more stories than journalists. There are more scoops to be uh, reported on, more exclusives to locate than journalists. So it's a bundle of potential for journalists who want to work in the field. And as you mentioned, the Naveed of Kari story was a major story that I reported on when it first surfaced in late August of 2020, and then President Trump tweeted my FoxNews.com story about Afkari, and that sort of catapulted the persecution of this wrestler before he was murdered by the regime on September 12th into media stardom, so to speak. And that certainly helped President Trump's tweet, because Joe Rogan and other personalities, I think Dana White from the mixed martial art world, who has an enormous following, intervened and tried to persuade the regime to not murder Naveed Afkari, who simply was arrested and tortured because he protested against regime corruption in 2018, a year before the demonstrations you mentioned, where there were as many as 3,000 killings. So I guess what I'm saying is that there is a role for, I don't like the word activism, as you pointed out, and because that has a pejorative meaning within journalism, but I do think there's a role for accountability journalism, impact journalism. It's a very rare thing where journalists, I think, in general, can, because of their exposés, can influence a change in government policy, or perhaps change a university decision to, in the case of a story I'm working now, Oberlin College, to employ a former Iranian ambassador to the UN who covered up the murders of 5,000 innocent Iranian prisoners in 1988. And he's the professor of Islamic studies at Oberlin. He's still working there, but the university has now launched an investigation. He's also demonized the Baha'i, a persecuted faith in Iran. I know, Lisa, you are one of the top Iran experts in the U.S., and you, to my great envy, know Farsi, which I wish I knew. This is a very bad, unsavory character based on the evidence out there, including an Amnesty International report that says he committed crimes against humanity. So to return to your question, I do think there's the problem. I see it right now in modern journalism is the lack of investigative journalism. Newspapers have closed down investigative journalism departments. There's not the traditional spotlight team. Those sorts of teams that are famous at the Boston Globe. In many of your viewers, I'm sure, saw the film, have now shut down. And there's just a lot of stenography journalism out there where you can't, as Adam mentioned, really confront government spokespeople, whether at the U.S. State Department or other governments, about what they're doing, especially in the context of one of the most serious negotiations facing international security, namely the Iran nuclear talks in Vienna, Austria.
Right. And it's, the question then becomes, that puts us in a position of more than just journalists. And that's what I mean by activism. I don't like the word activists, but I think that that's the accusation. I think that that is the way that we're perceived when we are out to do this investigative journalism, when we are out to expose, when we're out to, set the narrative straight, when it is so incredibly flawed. And the Iran nuclear deal, I think, is the best example of all of that. I mean, how can the mainstream media bypass all of these human rights abuses? I mean, these are the bleeding heart liberals, and they're just turning a blind eye to journalists being thrown in prison for a mere Facebook post, or, these athletes, women, homosexuals being marginalized in that society, and they're closing their eyes to that, and they're choosing to believe a different narrative. It's like flopped, right? So now conservatives are all of a sudden all about the emotional, the human rights abuses that are going on in Iran. Those are the ones who are championing their cause on social media and elsewhere, and the liberals are the ones who are saying, no, the deal is what is going to make us, the appeasement is what's going to make this a better world. How did we get here, Adam?
It's an interesting evolution in journalism, right? That in past years, and I often tell people that us here, we are very much dinosaurs in this business. The idea of performing journalism the way that we do is not the way journalism is performed now, especially by people younger. They're hired by news organizations, and they come from college steeped in ideology. And the ideology really guides their reporting. Now, that can be from a conservative or a liberal standpoint. You see it on both sides. I work for a publication that is considered to come from the conservative side of things, but I would say if you cut the masthead off of any piece of journalism I've put out and attached any other on it, it would read like a neutral piece of news, which is always what I've done and what I go for. But in many ways, that's not the case anymore in the macro level, right? Barry Weiss, who resigned from the New York Times, I think has put this very expertly in her writings and various interviews she's done on the topic, that in these newsrooms, if you're not writing within the ideology and within that box, and often for these newsrooms at major papers, it's this woke-ish kind of narrative box that they're put in. If you're not writing in that frame, you're accused of being a conservative, being a racist, caring too much about Israel, as Barry was accused of. And that's very much what we see also in the coverage of Iran, that the administration, when they're answering questions about their diplomacy with Iran, the fundamental underpinning, the ideology here is that of course it's good to speak with these people. Of course it's good to try to bring them into the community of nations. And when that view is challenged, then you're accused of being conservative, being accused of wanting war. When really, for at least people like me, these questions are about not coming from a certain ideology. These questions are about understanding where they're coming from. And those questions they're not willing to answer.
Yeah, it's tremendous to me. It's like what you said, if you take the masthead off, your articles could stand that test of journalistic integrity, right? But let's say you, God forbid, would leave the Free Beacon and try to get a job at the Washington Post or the New York Times. It would never happen. No,
they would never hire me, which is interesting because, again, I would dare anybody to hold that journalism up anywhere. I was ranting to a friend over drinks last night or the night before the Rudy Giuliani story, which is not my bag. I don't really cover much politics these days, but just the idea that the New York Times, the Washington Post, and these papers could make such an egregious error and have to append such a retraction and correction to that story. If I, coming from a paper, again, that is seen as coming from the conservative ideology, if I made even the slightest of errors, people would seize all over it and say, look, fake journalist. But there's no repercussions for the other side of it.
No. And they're actually encouraged to move. It's almost like, when journalists are chasing a story, now it's that the story is chasing the journalist who already, basically anticipated the conclusion of the outcome, because they
That's
consider
exactly
themselves
right.
opinion
That's exactly
shapers.
Right.
Right.
They know where they want to go and what they want to get. And when a source confirms it for them, they willingly print it. There's no critical thinking anymore. They've lost that ability to actually step back from the story and say, should I be trusting this source? The information is too sexy. It's too good. So, of course, they're willing to run with these stories.
But what do we do, Benjamin? How do we take the first step in correcting this as a society, as an industry right here?
Well, I'm somewhat pessimistic about reforming journalism right now. I think what journalists can do is simply adhere to the basic principles of journalism, which is when you're verifying sources, there should be a rigorous journalistic method of verification, and double sourcing is always good. Try to avoid anonymous sources as much as possible, and consult with your editor if you're going to use an anonymous source in a rare situation. But I think the way to change things is to push for more investigative journalism that will lead to bigger scoops, that will lead to sort of possibly earth-shattering stories, and that will help media organizations that are trying to stay independent of ideology or partisan politics, and allow those media organizations to garner more readers. Because in the end, I think the readership wants scoops, wants breaking news without bias or crude ideology, and that can be done, and that helps in the end garner more readers. And especially if you cover stories, as you mentioned, Lisa, Iran has executed since 1979, since the Islamic Revolution until 2008, according to a British WikiLeaks cable, 4,000 to 6,000 gays and lesbians. Now, I reported in 2019, based on a Farsi language news item in Iran, that Iran had just executed a man based on its anti-gay law. And thanks to the then German ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, who then went on to become acting director of national intelligence, who's the first openly gay cabinet member in the history of politics. He served in the Trump administration. He went on record and launched a campaign to decriminalize homosexuality across the world. So there is this interplay between politics and government, especially when there are government officials who are genuinely concerned about human rights in totalitarian regimes. And I think journalism also needs to focus on areas of the world that are severely underreported. Again, Iran's an example. Qatar imposes the death penalty on gays. They're going to host the World Soccer Championship, I think, next year in 2022. I think thousands of migrant workers have been murdered, have died during the construction of soccer stadiums there. These stories, don't get much attention, and there are reasons why they don't get much attention, in my view, because these regimes spend a lot of money to lobby in the United States, especially Qatar, and I would argue Turkey, and they don't seem to be front and center in the U.S. media reporting. And I think there's got to be a shift, because again, I do think Americans are genuinely interested in knowing what countries are lobbying the U.S. government, and how does that affect us as American taxpayers.
Yeah, I think you hit the next topic, and beautifully segued us there. I think the question for many, average Americans, I hate to use the word average because they're not average. They're wonderful information-seeking people that do not have access to certain information. So these people that are reading the mainstream media, that are, when you make a statement like that these countries are influencing our government, are influencing our media, their immediate question is, wait, but how? They're thousands of miles away. How are they doing so? And I don't think it's common knowledge that these countries, these regimes, have ambassadors working right here in the United States, many of whom are in Washington, and many of whom are working in the White House. People don't understand this. They don't get this. Particularly, you mentioned Qatar. You mentioned what other country did you just mention right now? We had Qatar, we had Turkey, but I would say the other one that is the most important, I think, is the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime and its tentacles here in Washington, in Los Angeles, in New York, in creating not just a think tank, not just different media, having access to different media outlets, but truly making a difference in all different sectors of society. They have comedians, they have people in Hollywood, they have all these different Trojan horses to affect opinion. Now, in your work, Adam, as a journalist, I mean, how relevant is that? And I'll give some examples so that people can understand what I'm getting at. We have journalists working for the New York Times. We actually invited one of them here today. She's an Iranian who works for the New York Times. We wanted her to join this conversation so that she can perhaps tell us about her perspective and why she reports the way that she does. And there are many others. I don't want to single just one out, but we have many, many Iranians working here in the United States in the capacity of journalists and activists and human rights experts and pundits, professors, as Benjamin stated, that are really controlling the narrative as to getting back into the nuclear deal, as to whitewashing the crimes of the Iranian regime, removing the sanctions, and making it all about the people. NPR recently did a slideshow, The Beautiful Dreams That Are Burnt, Portraits from Iran Under Sanctions, which I tweeted and said, well, where are the portraits from the people suffering under 42 years of tyranny under this regime? So, it's pick and choose. And they so beautifully package this. The Iranian regime's propaganda handbook doesn't stay in Tehran. It's made its way to Washington. My question to you, Adam, is how has this affected your work? What have you seen them do that our audience would be interested in seeing the influences of these tentacles here on U.S. soil?
Yeah, there's a whole host of things, and it goes very deep. And both you and Ben are right to point out that it's not just the Iranians, and in fact, it's probably to a lesser extent them. The foreign money wars in Washington, D.C. is one of the most fascinating topics you can dig into, and one of the most complex topics because that foreign money touches so many different things. That is money from Qatar, Turkey, to a lesser extent, Iran, and many others. They're hiring high-priced think tanks. They're hiring high-priced law firms, high-priced PR shops. So you can imagine the influence is pretty much everywhere. And in D.C., which is a relatively small town, it's not too difficult to get a critical mass in your pocket, so to say. And that does influence coverage because the reporters go to the think tanks. The think tanks are paid by these foreign governments. And, et cetera, et cetera. But speaking to Iran specifically, you have several think tanks. I'm sure you know NIAC very well, and Ben does as well, headed by Trita Parsi, or was headed by Trita Parsi, who's really been a regime advocate and anti-sanctions voice and has ingratiated himself with virtually all of the major players in a Biden administration, Obama administration, the veterans of Democratic administrations. I reported back during the Obama administration that Parsi and other prominent Iranian regime sympathizers were hosted at the White House dozens and dozens of times. And you can imagine all the things they were talking about there. So the power really reaches to the upper echelons, and even somebody like the U.S. Iran envoy now at the State Department, Rob Malley. This was a guy who was originally fired from Barack Obama's first campaign for holding unauthorized talks with the Hamas terror group. So this really shows you the perspective that these folks come from. There's another one that I think bears mentioning, the Quincy Institute, a very innocuous sounding think tank where Trita Parsi now works as one of the top officials over there. This is a think tank that's funded by both the Kochs and George Soros. They've tag teamed on this. And it shows you where their ideological bent dovetails, and that is things like legitimizing an Iranian regime that wants nuclear weapons, that is saying that the U.S. has locked itself into forever wars and we should not even have a presence in the Middle East. That's very much where you see the intersection of these kinds of ideologies, and the money is a lot more than one could imagine. They don't disclose as much as they probably should, but this money is the thing that influences stuff like that echo chamber, that pro-Iran echo chamber that played such a integral role in pushing that 2015 accord. That money was moving between think tanks, between prominent academics, between even journalistic outlets. In NPR and PBS, people might be surprised to learn have taken money from an organization that's called the Plowshares Fund. They were a nonprofit that gives grants, and one of their chief things was pushing the Iran nuclear deal. So the money is everywhere, and not enough of it is really known.
I mean, I know all of this, but to hear you outline it, consecutively, the way that you
It's a
eloquently did.
subject that I've dug into a lot and could talk about for days. I did a podcast just a month or so ago. We spent an hour talking about the foreign money and the influence in DC. And even though we have things like FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, that's a law that mandates anybody working on behalf of a foreign government disclose their activities. In theory, that's good. The problem is it's almost never enforced.
Mm-hmm. And well, that's the issue here, right? If anything was enforced, none of this we wouldn't have gotten to the point we have, let alone, I mean, think tanks can develop and nonprofits can develop, NGOs can do what they want, and if they can raise money, well, we can't stop them. But what we can stop, and with what you'd think would happen, is that you wouldn't allow these individuals to be chosen to be cabinet members. You wouldn't think that Trita Parsi would be invited to the White House 26 times. I think it's in the archives. I heard that number thrown around. Don't quote me on it, but something along those lines. I mean, you don't even go to your best friend's house 26 times in a short period of a few years. So it's tremendous to look at the access which these people are given to spew their hatred for America, to bring people like Javad Zarif onto CNN for a primetime interview so he can spew more hatred for the Americans and to blame everything on America. Just fits into their narrative. Benjamin, what could we do to expose this? I know that it's very difficult to say, we know all of this, right? I mean, in our inner circles, we can say, this is where the money is coming from. This is what they're using the money to do. And their goal is to push this agenda. Now, other than the investigative journalism, I mean, how can we get more outlets onto this? How can we get more individuals to understand about this? And how can we do so without getting shut down?
Well, you just mentioned Mohammad Zarif, the Iranian Iranian regime foreign minister, and I just wanted to follow up on that because what I find unsettling is Zarif in 2019 in Tehran defended the Islamic Republic of Iran's law mandating the execution of gays and lesbians. A German reporter, a gay German reporter from the Bild, who asked him a question about why the regime executes gays after my article appeared in the Jerusalem Post. And Zarif said this is essentially Islamic morality in our land, and went on to continue to defend lethal homophobia in Iran. Now, what I find unsettling is that Zarif has given scores of interviews in the United States with large media organizations since that press conference in Tehran in 2019. And there has been one question about why he defends lethal homophobia in Iran and why the country continues its policy to wipe out its struggling LGBTQ community. So that's especially when we have very sophisticated journalists who can just pose the question, and it's ignored. I mean, it's a life and death question. It affects people in a life and death way. I mean, what else can be done? I think an educated population like the United States can start to ask questions of journalists and push journalists to pursue other lines of inquiry, other narratives, and hold not only U.S. government officials accountable, especially officials, as Adam mentioned, who are promoting the Iran nuclear deal, rejoining the nuclear deal that will allow Iran within 10 years to build a nuclear weapon, to hold those officials accountable. That is, journalists should be confrontational, assertive in questioning these officials and digging up material about what's happening in these negotiations, but also asking foreign officials. I mean, there are still news organizations across the world, CNN, Fox, other news organizations that have correspondents in foreign countries, Washington Post, I think Fox News does a terrific job, but other news organizations that have journalists spread across the world certainly could expose what's happening in those countries in terms of unsavory deals. One example I'll mention, and I'll end it here on this point, is the German ambassador to the United States aggressively pushed to lobby the Congress a number of years ago. This was during the Trump period, to not oppose the Nord Stream 2 energy project between Germany and Vladimir Putin. So this is a massive energy deal that would advance the interests of a ruthless authoritarian leader, Vladimir Putin, in Russia. And basically, and Trump and the Trump administration has made this point a number of times, would ensure that Germany's energy policy is dependent on Russia, a major adversary of the United States. So the German ambassador in Washington was running around and aggressively lobbying U.S. Congress. And as far as I know, there were very few publications in the U.S. that reported on this. I think maybe Free Beacon did. I'd have to check. But the point is that it was a German paper picked it up, the bill, and reported on it, but it then sort of died a natural death.
Yeah, I wonder though, based on what both of you were telling me, it reminded me of my own experiences in covering a lot of sensitive topics and then getting death threats and then getting my website potentially hacked into. I mean, they didn't, but they try, and they keep trying. And they're trying to silence us by intimidating us. I want to ask both of you that question. Benjamin, I'll start with you. I mean, have you faced any of these threats or anything that would kind of tell you that they want you to stop doing what you're doing, that you're going too far?
I mean, there's always, this type of rhetoric on social media. I mean, I'm active on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook, and I've experienced, these types of threats, or the Qatari regime blasted me on its Washington website for its embassy based on a report I did revealing that that Qatar reportedly financed Hezbollah, a U.S. designated terrorist organization in Lebanon. I did a big story with a colleague of mine here in Israel, Jonathan Spire, for FoxNews.com, and Qatar issued that type. It wasn't a threat, more of a, it just showed that they don't appreciate how the freedom of press works, because there's no freedom of the press, and the Qatari monarchy is non-existent. I don't, threats don't bother me. It comes with this line of work. Death threats come with this line of work. I mean, I reported on the border of Syria and Turkey during the rise of the Islamic State in 2013 and crossed into Syria. So, heated rhetoric or rhetoric that's filled with death threats, it just doesn't faze me, because it's just rhetoric at the end of the day. I think we just have to, as journalists, just continue to plow through it and not have, as many journalists do, I think, especially in Europe, sort of a dangerously thin skin. I think, just develop a thick skin, plow forward, continue with your stories, and you'll be fine. Yeah.
Same question to you, Adam.
Yeah, I have to say, luckily, in terms of threats of violence or, harming my physical safety, I haven't experienced too much of that. On social media, you always have a certain amount of vitriol. There tons of anti-Semites on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere on social media, and probably way too many people sitting in front of their computer screens wearing tinfoil hats. Those people are out there. They exist. The internet is filled with them. It doesn't bother me too much. I will say, though, one of the things that actually is dangerous is when you write critically about foreign governments, and this goes back to our conversation about foreign money in Washington, D.C. Many of these, let's call them wealthy, oil-rich nations, retain Washington, D.C. lobbying shops. And they're very quick to send out a legal letter threatening news organizations with lawsuits, with accusations of libel and these types
Mhm.
of things. And I think that's often very effective. Luckily, the Free Beacon, we pride ourselves on our accuracy and fact checking, and we've never had a serious issue with that. But you can see how people can use this, especially governments that are being written about critically, how they use this threat of a lawsuit to intimidate reporters, to intimidate news outlets against
Mhm.
performing this type of journalism. That frightens me more than anything else, because there are a lot of smaller players that I think could be influenced, could be intimidated by these tactics. And of course, it's not very expensive for, again, these oil-rich Middle Eastern nations to just have their lawyers in D.C. fire off a letter or words. I've certainly been on the receiving end of them in the past. They've never materialized into anything, because at the end of
Right.
the day, the journalism is factually accurate. But that I think is much more chilling than the threats of violence, or at least from my end, are, because I just haven't experienced too many serious threats of to my safety.
Well, let's keep it that way, right?
God
Well,
willing.
I want to end the program here. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I thank you both. And I encourage everyone out there, if you're interested in these topics, these guys are the star players in the arena. We have been, my producer has been putting your handles on the bottom of the screen here. And we will again promote this across social media so that people can follow you and follow your work and keep up with the breaking news out of the Middle East that you're not seeing anywhere else and out of the State Department. Keep pressing them and keep being brave and keep telling us the truth and reporting the way that you do. And I thank you both. I appreciate you both. And I hope you'll be back on our program soon. And for the rest of you who'd like to subscribe to our weekly podcast, you can go to youtube.com/Lisa Daftari. You can also get our podcast wherever you get your podcasts, on all the popular platforms. And if you'd like to sign up for our daily top 10 email, go to foreigndesknews.com/newsletter. You can sign up there. See you all next week.